Hello, comedy writers and comedy writing enthusiasts. Welcome to my talk on why great comedy requires great pain. For those who don't know me, I'm Daniela Saioni. I did pro-am stand-up for 8 years, and I was in the film business working on set on film and TV comedies for too many decades as a script supervisor, and I am now a comedy screenwriter with many awards to my name. And most important of all, I've been training comedians and regular people to turn their lives or acts into film and TV scripts since 2012. I don't know what is compelling me to do that, but I absolutely love it. Now, it's probably no secret to any of us that the funniest people we know are often the saddest people, or they've undergone huge tragedies in their lives. The world kind of woke up to that with Robin Williams' suicide. But anyone in comedy knows how much depression permeates our community. There was a study done in 1975 of 55 comedians earning over $100,000, so they were considered successful, and still 80% of them were in therapy. This is a true story, and the interesting part of that study was many of them were terrified to heal from their pain because they thought they would no longer be funny if they did. I did a bit of research on the childhoods of some of my favorite comics, and some you wouldn't even associate with trauma. Like Stephen Colbert, for example. He has had a particularly tragic event in his life. He lost his father and his two brothers at the age of 10 in a plane crash. Well, that would mess anybody up. And Carol Burnett had two parents who were alcoholics, and she was raised by her grandmother. And The Sound of Laughter was this, and I'm sure a lot of comics in the audience can relate, it was this addictive thing that she wanted more of in her life. And Richard Pryor. Okay, he is African American, and there can be a lot of pain associated with that in general, especially growing up in the era that he did. But he actually had it particularly hard. His mom was a prostitute and his dad was a pimp, and he grew up in a brothel. Hilarious comedian, of course. And Maria Bamford often calls out her depression in her act, and of course she's a hilarious, wonderful, successful comic as well. So yes, I'm sure that we can pretty much agree that many comedians have either battled depression or have undergone some great pain in their lives. Now, that's not to say that everybody else can't access comedy, because, spoiler alert, if you stick around on the planet long enough, you will eventually experience pain and suffering. Now, I didn't agree with this report when I read it, but the British Journal of Psychiatry said that comics were more likely to experience a lack of ability to feel social and physical pleasure and possess a mild distaste for humanity. But when I thought about it, I've actually been to parties which were half comedians and half filmmakers, and guess which side was the very somber side of the room? So maybe there's something to that. I can see how that's true for so many comics I've known, but that's not true for me, so don't feel like you have to fit into anything I'm saying to fit into what a great comic is. But these are traits that have been clinically observed about comedians over and over again. There are many theories about why sadness is so pervasive among comedians. The biggest one being that we learn to laugh or make other people laugh as a coping and survival mechanism as children because we were sensitive, reclusive, and picked on or bullied by others. Joan Rivers has said that she didn't know of any comedian who was the popular kid in school. It's true, and I'm somewhat guilty of this bias. I tend not to trust good-looking comedians, to be honest, and that's terrible because ultimately everyone's gone through some level of pain and suffering. Everyone. But comedians tend to be outsiders, and one of the ways we were able to achieve dominance in the schoolyard or any kind of small amount of power in our lives is through making people laugh. So it follows that we would become comedians later in life or use comedy as a way to survive some extreme conditions that we had to face. That is learned behavior. Not that we're psychotic, by the way. Someone said, well, then we should all be very damaged people. And I don't think that's the case. I mean, obviously, comedy changes the world, and comedians do brave things just by getting up on stage every day. There's another study that correlates depression and very high intelligence, and I think that might be more the culprit because comedians were also found to have above average intelligence in general. You can Google this, it's all been studied. So imagine there's a God. Imagine there's a God and she creates this baby, and she endows the baby with a sense of humor and a high intelligence and a hypersensitivity to the world. but maybe in looks not so much, or maybe, I don't know, whatever markers of beauty are the societal norm, maybe not. And or maybe not a lot of money, all of that. And she sends that baby out into the world. There's a good chance that baby could become a comic. So that's the general theory around it of why comedians themselves are sad. But now let's talk about how we can mine that sadness in our work. Okay, so one way to fill the void of depression is to connect with other humans. And as comedians, we do that on stage by getting them to laugh. Now, very often when people laugh, the very first laughs you're going to get early on in your joke, during your setup especially, are laughs of recognition. There are people connecting with you in a comedy club through laughter because they acknowledge the truth in what you're saying. It might be a truth that many other people are afraid to say out loud, but you're not. But they recognize that truth and then they laugh. Here's an example of an early joke I used to tell that wasn't even a joke, it was just a true story that would get laughs. My Italian Canadian mom is pretty tough. She's 5'2" and she once got held up in broad daylight by a very large gunman. She just looked at him and said, "So shoot me." And he ran away. He didn't know who he was dealing with. My mom was working nights in a plastics factory for minimum wage. You shoot her, you're just giving her away out of her shift. And so the job of the comedian, which is also the job of the writer, yes, even if you don't perform comedy on a stage, but you write any kind of comedic fiction, your job is to tell the truth. But your job is to tell the truth in a way that creates tension, then will allow the audience to release their tension and their pain in recognition through laughter. We have to tell the truth, even the most tragic of truths, in a way that is digestible. I read about a theory put forward by Tom Viach and the Humor Research Lab that called this the benign violation. So we can say things that are pretty offensive, that are a violation, that the average person couldn't just start talking about openly, but we get away with it on stage because we're able to phrase or present it in a way that can be palatably consumed by the audience to the point where they laugh, and laughter is a release of tension, right? I had a heckler comment on one of my comedy writing course ads on Facebook. Yes, there are people who do this. He wrote, "There's no art or craft to comedy at all. There's just timing." Sure, okay, but comedic timing is what helped make that tension and release, right? So if you don't build up the tension in the audience, either talking about a painful or taboo subject in the first place, if you don't make them uncomfortable to a degree, usually achieved by talking about a painful truth, if you don't create that tension in the first place, there's nothing to release. So, tension and release, truth and pain. Okay, so what's the difference between comedy and tragedy then? Writers of tragedy are also telling the truth. They're talking about pain and they're dealing with really, really bombastic pain issues in some cases. So what is the difference? Both comedy and tragedy, as we've come to understand them in Western culture at least, are derived from the Greeks, who have said that the difference between the two is through the way the protagonist is presented. So in comedy, your protagonist is a fool. He's an everyman, she's an everywoman. They are a fool embarking on a fool's journey, while the hero in drama is sort of a heroic superhuman specimen going on a journey of valor. The comedic character has inappropriate goals, and they have many flaws. I go deeper into all that in my comedy writing classes, but it's important for you to know that distinction so you'll know if you're heading in the right direction when you're setting up your premises for TV shows and movies. And the other main difference between a comedy and a tragedy is that one makes you laugh and the other makes you cry. That means you don't know until you deliver it if it's going to be funny, right? We say this in stand-up. If the audience laughs, I'm a comedian, and if they don't, I'm a performance artist. So how do you know if you've gone too far in what you've written? How do you know if you've gone too far in a joke, in the presentation of your pain? The audience will tell you. That's the beauty of being a stand-up. You get the feedback right away, and you get really accustomed to learning how far you can go. But in the writer's room, in television or in film writing, how do you know you've gone too far if there's no audience in front of you? In my comedy writing classes, we do idea testing, or what I refer to as idea jamming. We present and jam on each other's ideas and jokes, and we test them on the group of writers present. That's why TV writers' rooms are full of people. It's not just one writer. It's usually 6 to 12, or if you're on a Chuck Lorre show, there might be as many as 20 to 40 writers, depending on the budget of your show. Yes, so the audience will tell you, or as a writer, you idea test on people who are in your intended audience, or at least in your writer's room. Okay, now I'm going to tell you a story because this is a really good story. I got to work with Paul Feig as his script supervisor on a simple favor, and I had to ask him about the shitting in the street scene in Bridesmaids. Of course, I had to ask him. If you look at the poster for Bridesmaids, it looks like an innocuous romantic comedy chick flick. But in reality, it gets really dark and truthful about the experience of being female right from the very first second in the very first scene. Then you get to that part of the movie when they're dress shopping, and it's one of the funniest scenes in comedic film history, right? So I said to Paul, how did you know that was going to get a laugh? That was kind of a big risk for your audience. And he basically said, well, I didn't know. His instincts as a comedy writer director, of course, led him to believe it would be funny, but the truth is, he said they shot two different endings for that scene, and they also shot other material that got cut after they put the scene in front of a test audience. So currently, if you're not familiar with the scene, you must see it, first of all. It's just a great example of truth and pain in comedy, and also of something else we discuss in my classes, Game of the Scene. Basically, the scene is these women are trying on very pristine, expensive bridesmaids' dresses, and by the end of the scene, the bride is wearing an expensive dress, sitting in traffic, shitting in the street. So, the alternate ending to that was she gets hit by a car and goes flying. That's obviously also very painful, but which one is more truthful and painfully embarrassing and maybe even more relatable to an audience? As they were considering their options, he told me that co-writer Annie Mumolo pitched the ending that worked. Why can't she just give in and relax into it? He also said they got really graphic in the scene work inside the dress shop. If you remember the scene in the bathroom, of course, it gets really, really graphic and keeps escalating. Someone defecates in a sink and then someone throws up in someone's hair. But Paul said they actually went even farther when they shot it. They had feces all over the wall in the bridal shop hallways, and at that point, the audience stopped laughing in the test screenings. So that test screening showed him that they had gone too far. So yeah, how do you know if you've gone too far? The audience will tell you, and then the editor will just cut that part out until the scene is at its maximum funny. We often shoot options for jokes and even visual gags in comedy, TV, and film, and I go through all that in my programs. Okay, so how does any of what I'm telling you today relate to TV comedy writing? Well, for one thing, modern TV, usually half-hour TV shows, whether they're shot in front of a live studio audience or whether they're single camera, which is the way most of the shows we see are shot, without a live audience. In either case, the line between drama and comedy is blurred more and more and more in the modern age to great effect. One of the shows I love is the Australian show by stand-up Josh Thomas, Please Like Me. It's hilarious, but it's also really, really uncomfortable and dark content. If you think about what it's really about, and Fleabag as well, they're wonderful, dark, 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 and Russian Doll, Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. These are all shows built on incredible foundations of pain, but the pain underneath those shows doesn't seem so painful in their execution, right? Look at the subject matter of the shows and the tone of the shows. Let's look at those two things, because Fleabag is basically a show about a woman who's a sex addict, and because of her depression and because of her own sexual addiction, she feels responsible, and she may indeed be responsible for her best friend's death or suicide. It's a little bit unclear if she killed herself or it was an accident, but that's pretty dark stuff either way, right? And if you think of the greatest comedies, they come from that dark place. With my comedy writers, the thing I always say to them is ask yourself at every single juncture of writing, what is the worst thing that can happen? And then I say short of death. But if you watch Russian Doll, she dies so many times in that show, right? So sometimes actually dying is appropriate to your premise, depending on what your concept is. But I say, what is the worst thing that can happen short of death to that character? So it's got to be specific to that character's wound and that character's pain, which is not necessarily spelled out for the audience in flashbacks, by the way, but is always evident and expressed through their major flaw. It's the secret to constructing a brilliant comedic character, and it's also the way to becoming a great writer who can conceptualize the most painful scenario resulting from the specificity of the character they have created and then execute it in a way that evokes laughter. I'll talk about that in a sec, but I just want to give you some more examples of how pain is used in modern day TV writing. The show Catastrophe, which has won numerous awards, just like Fleabag has, is about a guy who grew up without a father. Well, he grew up with a deadbeat dad, and he now wants nothing more than to be a good father. And he's impregnated a total stranger, and she has been given a cancer diagnosis just before she found out she was pregnant. Okay, once again, how dark can you get? That's pretty dark, right? Those are two insanely painful situations that come together to create a great comedy. And the tone of your show, by the way, doesn't have to be that dark. Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt is an example of a really funny, light, and colorful show about a woman who was held captive in a doomsday cult as a teenage girl for 15 years. I know so many cult survivors in comedy, guys. These are real things. If I tell you about some of the scripts I've written, you're going to say, what the hell? How did you ever think that was a comedy idea? My first short film script was about the time I was working as an Arby's drive-thru cashier when I was 13 years old, and I was molested by my 18-year-old boss. True story. Doesn't sound very hilarious, and believe me, it wasn't at the time, but it got a lot of laughs at our read-through. My prof remarked that it read like an episode of Roseanne, despite the fact that it was about the sexual assault of a minor. Workshopping that script with actors inspired me to want to make it a movie, but a movie came out shortly thereafter about the darkly comedic world of teenagers working in fast food joints. Very similar world about the very similar pain of life in the fast food industry. I have so many students who write comedy about the most painful moments in their lives. You don't necessarily have to show it on screen, like ever. In the case of Kimmy Schmidt, it's implied in the character's backstory and it impacts how she sees the world now, but she gets it right out of the way in the pilot by saying, if you're wondering, yes, lots of sex stuff went down in the bunker. Your pain can certainly be your comedy gold. You don't have to hide it. You just have to deal with it and execute it in a way that is palatable so that people can digest it and still laugh. I know it sounds crazy, but think of all the examples I've given you so far, and there are so many more on shows that do this and shows that win numerous awards. The second script I wrote, which was the first TV pilot script I ever wrote, I was in comedy writing school, and I wrote about being a script supervisor who has a nervous breakdown and blows up her life and her marriage. I was so literal. You can write, by the way, directly about your pain or indirectly. So these are some direct examples I wrote about. It was about a script supervisor who goes home and her husband tries to kill her. She's able to walk out of that, just like I did, and her life changes forever. It was a comedy. Yes, I know. I presented it to my professor, and he said that one scene with the attempted murder, that one was kind of a downer. Yes, it was one I would have had to cut out or change, even though it was my truth, but it fueled all the changes I made in my own life, and it fueled the writing for that whole episode and that whole series concept. In a later draft, I probably could have removed that scene or alluded to it, or I could just make it more palatable in the way I presented it. I mean, I thought it was hilarious at the time because I was just fresh out of being able to deal with my own experience of domestic violence, but not yet experienced enough as a comedy writer to pull that off. And I had no writer's room group to run that by at the time either. Because even though I thought I was fine, I was still sort of going through and processing the pain of that. I think I'd written it within 2 years of that happening, and that was probably too soon. But it did lead me to find the fuel for the engine of this character's transformation in life, and it was also the fuel that got me to write and finish the script. So, very often and all the time, I will encourage all my writing students to write about their pain and think on their pain and reflect on it, because everyone's pain is different. We've all gone through different kinds of pain and experiences, and people will try to outpain you, believe me, in comedy, and they'll do a good job. But the art is in how to take that and transform it into something that we can laugh at, that you can laugh at, that you can survive. It's a whole process, but it does start with thinking about that pain. But the pain you write about cannot be one that you are currently still sitting in, because writing requires that you be clear. So if you're currently undergoing a massive amount of pain or trauma over something, I mean, I know we all are in a way. I know we're all living through a global pandemic. But I mean, if we're going through something traumatic and big, it's good to journal about it for sure, but maybe save the script writing for a few weeks or months or years down the road before you try to tackle that as a comedic concept. There needs to be a distance from the pain. So you can't just bleed on stage as a comic, and you can't just stand there and show the world your pain. That's not really going to work. I mean, it might work. It might elicit a few uncomfortable laughs, and you might be genuinely hilarious in those few awkward moments, but I would hate to live my life in a constant state of pain, like an open wound that's bleeding. I'm not advocating for that, even though Tig Notaro did the most brilliant set once she found out she was diagnosed with cancer. Okay, try it at your own risk. So I do hope you hear me out on that. But I do want you to tap into your personal and specific pain if you are writing comedy, because guess what? You may think you're the only person who's a cult survivor, or who's been sexually or physically assaulted or diminished, or I don't know, attempted murdered, but someone else's pain will be different from that, and yet you will find that they can still tap into your pain, because we all share that as human beings. We all experience pain. Now, it sounds like I'm saying that you write these scripts for therapeutic reasons. Okay, there's a level of that, I'm sure. I probably had to write those scripts involving assaults that I told you about. It was just coming out of me. I had to let that pain go. But ultimately, I could have rewritten them and changed what they were literally about. The point is that I got it out on the page. And I went on, by the way, later on to write other much funnier scripts about patriarchal violence that less directly dealt with my specific assault experiences, but did deal with the emotions surrounding them. We can use our pain directly or indirectly in our stories, but we need to use the truth of our pain in the work, because it's what will compel the audience and it's what they will identify with. It is what will carry your story forward until you release the tension with laughter. I teach people how to do that in my classes, but I want you to start thinking about grounding your comedy writing in a foundation of pain for now, especially as you come up with your premise. I do want to tell you one more story. One of my great writing partners, who's a filmmaker, took a writing class with Paul Schrader. Paul wrote Taxi Driver and Raging Bull. You might have heard of them. And he apparently asked everyone present, do you want to be a writer? Do you know your shit? Do you know what your shit is? Meaning, do you know what wound you have that you keep going back to over and over again in life? He said, guess what? You better know your shit, because you're going to be writing about it for the rest of your life. And that's true, right? Some of us have, I don't know, abandonment issues, and all the stories that they write in some way relate to abandonment issues. For the longest time, until my dad died, I had severe daddy issues, so a lot of my scripts had some daddy issue component to them. But I was just beginning to understand my shit, my psychology at that point. And whether or not you understand your psychology, you're going to be writing about it. So you might as well understand it. Then you'll have a bit more control. That's why the distance part comes into the equation in comedy. You know, sometimes people define comedy as tragedy plus distance. Truth, pain, and time is another way to describe comedy. The reason for that distance is you need to actually be able to analyze and reflect on it at a certain point in the writing process. So you need to figure out what happened to you and why you behaved the way you did afterwards, why that's funny, and how that can be presented as something that could be funny to make other people laugh. And you know, as comics, we have a way of seeing the world for its truth, and maybe also for its beauty. But it's the reason many of us are so sad. But it's also the reason we can do this. It's the reason we can write in a way that shines a light on the sadness, and there is an art and there is a craft to it. And whether you agree with me or not, it's my point of view, it's my experience, it's what I've seen in my students' work, including the most successful ones, over and over again. I can take a brand new writer, and once I get them thinking along the lines of tapping into that pain, then we can move forward faster from there, and they can write a really strong first script. I've seen it. We all have at least one story in us, and we have probably many, many more, but that is an effective place to start looking inward towards your pain. So your pain is your comedy gold. It's the thing that's going to fuel your characters, whether it's directly or indirectly related to your specific pain, but your understanding of it will fuel your script and get you to create a compelling concept and a compelling story. If you have tried to write comedy screenplays before but didn't know where to start, or you don't think you're funny, or if the hardest part for you is landing on the premise you want to work on in the first place, I have created 2 different 5-day writing challenges, which both ask you to start with your pain, one for TV comedy series premises and one for comedy feature film. I will post the links below the description for each. The TV one especially asks you to go deeper into that pain because you need to fuel potentially hundreds of stories in your show. And I think it's really important that it is also a personal premise that you land on, especially if you're a new writer. That personal stake will get you to write your script and finish it, and that's important. But also, if it gets to the point where you're actually trying to sell and pitch your script to other people, which is possible, I've had students sell their very first script. If it's personal to you, especially in television, you will probably get the chance to stay on the project. That's right, it's very common for inexperienced writers to get replaced when ideas get bought. Even experienced writers get replaced sometimes. But if it's a story that you can specifically tell, you will be more than likely asked to stay on the project. So that's why I want you to start from the personal. Both my challenges are different, except one specific exercise, which is really required of all comedy writing, because TV and feature film have different storytelling needs. But the challenges both have the same structure. Each day, I post a video and worksheet with a specific writing exercise that should take you no longer than 30 minutes a day to complete. However, in the TV writing challenge, I do ask you to go deeper into pain, so you should set aside 1 full hour on that day. And then by the Friday, and I have tested these challenges out on hundreds of writers in many different countries, most of you will have 1 or more personal premises for your comedy series and TV shows that you want to write. If this is of interest to you, join me in one of my challenges. I'll post the information below. Happy writing, even if it's about sadness.